Game over, man. Game over.
Johnny. You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man. This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for September 20th, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us for this conversation, everybody. I don't know about a haunting in Venice, but there is a haunting in South Florida. Perhaps, arguably, maybe, who knows?
This story once again. For those of you who are patrons of ours, patreon.com/InSessionFilm, you may have already heard this story, but it is a fascinating one.
Yeah, I'll repeat little tidbits of it here for those that are not patrons. Many of you listening to this are probably not part of our Patreon, but you can sign up, patreon.com/InSessionFilm.
Yep.
You can sign up for as low as $1 a month, and you'll hear all of our exclusive Patreon episodes over there.
Indeed.
And if you are a patron, you'll be able to hear this in much more detail than I'm about to go into here. However,
there are 4 parts to this story on our Patreon episode.
Yeah, essentially it boils down to there are some weird things happening in my house. Some of it is when Brennan and I are recording these episodes. We'll see if anything spooky happens during this review. And if it does, I'm leaving it in. I'm not.
At this point, given what we're talking about on this episode, I think you need to leave it in.
I think I need to, because when these weird things happen in previous episodes, I have edited them out, of course. But there's been some weird things that I cannot explain that seem on its face physically impossible that have happened in my household. And then there's just been some weird things with my son, who otherwise is very healthy and vibrant and vigorous and everything that comes with being an 8-year-old. He's a wonderful child whom I love and adore. But there have been a few incidents lately that make you wonder, there's something else going on. And I'm not entirely sure what it may be. Yeah. And I do get into that in more detail again on Patreon if you want to go and check that out. So
or don't. It's actually a pretty creepy story.
Yeah, it is a bit weird. So again, I don't know about any hauntings in Venice, but there might be one in this room as we speak.
Well,
so who knows?
That's a heck of a sequel to this movie. You got to grow that mustache, look like Kenneth Branagh, and all of a sudden just film yourself doing your own haunting in your own hometown.
I know. So we'll see how it goes. Obviously, we're here to talk about Kenneth Branagh's new film, A Haunting in Venice. This is directed by Kenneth Branagh.
Indeed.
It stars, you won't believe it, but Kenneth Branagh is
Who's
in
he?
this. I know. As well as Tina Fey. Some people know her. Jamie Dornan. Michelle Yeoh. Among many others that we'll get into. If you're not familiar with A Haunting in Venice, in post-World War II, and again, you won't believe this, in Venice, World War II, post-World War II. Perot, now retired and living in his own exile, reluctantly attends a seance. But when one of the guests is murdered.
You got to say murdered.
It is up to the former detective to once again uncover the killer. Before we get into this, let's briefly backtrack to the first two. What do you think about this series of films from Kenneth Branagh thus far?
Well, I first have to say, JD, you and I are very much in the world of film criticism and hashtag film Twitter, whatever you want to call it. So we know more or less what movies are coming out, what franchises still exist and whatnot. I had no idea this movie was even coming out until I first saw the trailer. Like maybe a couple months ago, I saw the trailer in front of some movie. I was like, wait a minute, they're making a third one of these? Why does it look so different?
Okay.
So there was kind of a surprise element there, which sort of took me back to that time when you would see a movie as a kid and you were first introduced to maybe a sequel or some movie you're excited about because you first saw the trailer in the theater. Like, there was something very exciting about that. I kind of had that moment with A Haunting in Venice,
Interesting.
which is a
Okay.
weird thing to say because on its face, it shouldn't be a movie I would be all that excited for. I do genuinely like Murder on the Orient Express. I think that's
Same.
actually a pretty darn good movie, on the verge of being pretty underrated, if you ask me.
Mhm.
Death on the Nile sucks. I'm sorry. I don't like that movie at all. That's a
Fair.
2-hour mystery movie that felt like 7 hours. And never once did I believe that they were on a boat. Like, I just never bought it. Never did. Now that movie did have some of its own production issues. The fact it was
Yeah.
made during COVID and how that sort
Yeah.
of bled into production. So it's hard for
Yeah.
me to be it's hard for me to be that cynical about it when I know that there are unfortunate circumstances that led to perhaps why the film wasn't as good as its predecessor. But so I'm hit or miss on what Kenneth Branagh has been doing, but the idea of what he's doing here with A Haunting in Venice and just how different it feels is what had me somewhat interested in seeing this one, to see comparatively what he was going to be doing, because it has a very different vibe when compared to the other two.
Yeah, I am almost completely with you. Death on the Nile is not great. But Murder on the Orient Express, I think, is genuinely very good. And I'm with you.
It's
I
very
think it
solid,
is actually pretty underrated because people have been quick to call A Haunting in Venice easily the best of the three. Now, we'll get into it. We'll talk about if it is the best of the three.
Yeah.
Regardless, though, I don't think we, and maybe I am alone, maybe we are more alone in this. I don't know. But I
Yeah.
don't think we should be quick to judge in that sense, because I think Murder on the Orient Express is much closer in quality, performance-wise, storytelling-wise, and even cinematography-wise. I think that is somewhat lost in all this. It is clear. The social discourse on A Haunting in Venice, to me, it is vividly clear that people have not seen that film since 2017. People have not gone back to watch
I
it.
feel like the narrative is really using Death on the Nile as its primary comparison. And
Yeah.
and if you're going to do that, then yeah, there is validity to that. But when you're only looking at that second film, then you're overlooking a glaring,
Yeah.
a glaring issue in the fact that Murder on the Orient Express is a fairly well-made movie.
I agree. I mean, when you talk about Branagh's filmmaking, the use of long takes, the tracking shots of that film, the unique camera angles, which of course Venice has as well, and the production design, design, excuse me, of Orient Express, all of that to me, I think is really good. And I think rivals A Haunting in Venice. So I do think people should go back and revisit that film, especially through the lens of A Haunting in Venice, because I think people will be surprised. That film is way closer to Venice than people give it credit for. But you're right. I think maybe coming off the heels of Death on the Nile and how that film was, we'll say, lackluster. And maybe it was the COVID production that rendered that film what it is. I don't really know. But there's
Probably.
a clear gap, a huge chasm between Nile and the other two.
Yeah.
I definitely agree
Yeah.
with the consensus there. So with that laid out, big fan of Murder on the Orient Express.
I like it. Yeah.
So moving into A Haunting in Venice, which apparently was on my radar a lot more than it was for Brendan. I was looking forward to this. But Brendan, what did you think about A Haunting in Venice?
So I guess the burning question is this the best of the three? If you ask me, no, I don't think it is. I still think Murder on the Orient Express is my favorite of the three. And I say that with kind of a sting of disappointment because I think A Haunting in Venice should have been my favorite of the three. I think it's the most interesting in theory of the three here. And I like the idea that this one is way more bare bones when compared to Death on the Nile and A Haunting in Venice. The cast is a bit more stripped back. It's not quite as expansive, not quite as star-studded as those other two, even though it does have a great cast, A Haunting in Venice specifically. And there are clearly moments where this is shot on location in Venice. Like you can tell, and even though most of it does take place indoors, there is a tangibility to this one. There's a practicality to it. It really looks like there was less of a budget with this one. And I think that actually does add to the charm in many ways. And I feel like that has been the primary, I guess, discourse around this movie in comparison to the other two, and why so many people feel like it is the best of the three, because aesthetically it is doing something that I really do like, and I think it should be praised on those merits. I just don't think it's as smooth of a movie as Murder on the Orient Express. I think A Haunting in Venice was destroyed in the editing room. I think the editing here is atrocious. It just feels like there are scenes that are constantly being interrupted by a goal to shorten this to less than 2 hours. It just the flow did not work for me, and I don't know if that was a choice by the producers or if Branagh was more focused on trying to create sort of an energy and a vibe with his canted angles and the really macabre kind of tone that this is going for. And maybe that was a very deliberate choice to intercut the movie in a certain way, but it leads to an issue with tone with me, where at times I couldn't tell if this movie was meant to be a bit more comedic or really self-serious. And at times it kind of straddles the line to the point that it almost doesn't really work either way, which is unfortunate. I like what this movie is going for. And I like the story. I like the narrative. I like the directional choices that Branagh is making. And even some of the things thematically around faith and spirituality, or the practicality of that, especially from the perspective of a lead detective that works in practicality. That is his job, right? So I like that juxtaposition. I felt like there was a much smoother version of this movie that got lost in the editing room. And that is really what holds it back for me, which is why I think it's the most aesthetically interesting of the three films thus far. But I really do think Murder on the Orient Express is just a better movie. It flows better. It's told better. And by the time it reaches its conclusion, I felt something genuine about that. And I didn't quite get that here. Something just felt a little lost for me.
Okay. Well, I think we are going to agree and disagree with this film in many regards. I do think that A Haunting in Venice is quite good. I am pretty high on the film. In fact, I came out of the theater so engrossed by that aesthetic experience that maybe it tainted my overall perspective on the film a little bit.
Which is fair, because it is very aesthetically interesting.
It is. It is. As much as I love Murder on the Orient Express for the reasons I mentioned earlier, I think the production design and the camera work of that film is underrated.
Yeah.
But it does seem as if Branagh was cooking with much more of a vigor in terms of his camera work and aesthetics, and taking advantage of the horror tactics that he does here. Maybe gets a little bit too much with the jump scares at times.
Maybe. But I like that he's going for it. The creative juices are pretty inspired here at times.
I agree. On the whole, I think this is a really inspired effort from an aesthetic and a sound design perspective. I was wholly mesmerized by this film from a cinematic visual perspective. And I think the performances here are actually really good. Really, really good.
With the exception of one, I will agree with you. There's one performance I did not like. I'll get to that later.
Okay, we'll get to that here in a little bit. But I think Kenneth Branagh is once again capturing the heart and the poignancy that has come with this character in the previous two films. And that is the one thing I will give Death on the Nile credit for. As much as I don't love that film from a storytelling and especially a visual perspective, I do think the scenes of his character, again, tapping into that grief he's experiencing and where we learn more context about him in that film. I do think that film is at its best when it's doing that. And once again, we get Poirot here, demonstrating his loss of faith. And how God and religion and doubt is a big part of this film. I do like how the film seamlessly plays with those emotions with him, Perot. And Kenneth Branagh as a performer taps into that very well. Michelle Yeoh, it's funny seeing her in this film coming off the heels of her Oscar last year. I don't know when they filmed this. If it was at
I hope it was before, honestly.
Whatever she was doing last year or in the last few years, I hope that she's drinking the same waters because, oh my God, she's really great. Her screen time, I'll say vaguely, is limited comparatively to some of these other supporting performances.
She takes full advantage of it, man.
So good. It's so good. Yeah, it is incredible. There's
what a wonky performance. I loved it.
It's pretty wild. That one moment of catharsis, I'll say, that she has, her really big moment here.
Yeah.
It is divine. It is really, really fantastic. But I think all of these performances are quite good on the whole.
Okay.
So creatively, I do think there is so much here to appreciate and to like. Now, when it comes to the mystery, I like the mystery on paper.
Yeah.
I think my biggest issue with the storytelling here really comes down to two things. One, you're right. The pacing of the film is choppy. It is a little uneven, and I do think the editing is a big part of that, and you do feel that at times. There are moments where the film builds up this momentum, and then it becomes
instantly just cuts to the next scene. Yeah, it feels so interrupted. I feel like that's the best way I can put it.
And there's a few cuts here that just simply don't make sense to me
Yeah,
in terms of rhythm. Like just in terms of rhythm, it just seems a little odd. So there was something in the editing room that behind the scenes we may never know.
Yeah.
It is a little choppy here. And so it takes something that I think is really good on paper and, you know, it makes the film uneven. Maybe more frustratingly though, and this, I don't know, I don't think it's being talked about enough.
Okay.
It's redundant. This is emotionally and thematically ish anyway. It is Murder on the Orient Express. And again, I think people forget that. Now, it's hard to really delve into the details.
You're kind of right, actually. That's a good point.
But it is more or less the same thing. Why is that not being talked about? Now, again, it could be an adaptation thing. So I don't know if it's fair to judge the film on that or judge Kenneth Branagh. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I will say, and if we're just judging this trilogy as it is on its own terms in a vacuum, narratively speaking, this movie, while in a vacuum, I think is interesting. And there are some reveals that I find compelling, but is it really all that different from Murder on the Orient Express? Now, the specific reveals are, sure, those are a little different.
The mechanics are different, but the intent, the motivations are
pretty much
You're
the
right.
same.
They do kind of come from a similar emotional place, right?
Yeah.
I kind of sense that. You're right.
Yeah, really the big difference is Murder on the Orient Express is rooted in, you know, the similar emotional turmoil, but the crux of it is rooted in a political injustice. Whereas in A Haunting in Venice, it's more from a spiritual injustice.
Sure.
That's really the only distinction between the two, but emotionally,
yeah, you're basically just swapping a
coming from the same
MacGuffin,
place.
but it's
exactly.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I guess kind of similarly to Murder on the Orient Express, the fact that you've got different, I guess, demographics of characters that have different beliefs, if you want to call it that, whether it be political or spiritual. In this case, I like that this movie presents a group of characters and a cast that are basically filled with like doubters and believers, and you kind of have it split literally down the middle. But you're right, that's not too dissimilar from Murder on the Orient Express, just swapping the spiritual with the political, right? It does kind of have That's a good point, man. Now I can't unsee that.
Yeah, and so as much as I do like A Haunting in Venice, I think that some of the discourse has been I don't want to say disingenuous because it's probably coming from a place of sincerity, but it may be misguided or it's coming from a place of misremembrance.
Well, yeah. I have another theory about that too, and I think part of it is maybe the just we talk about the art of adaptation, right? And it's not just the art of adaptation, but it's the art of adapting an adaptation, right? Because Murder on the Orient Express is also in some ways a remake of a movie that was already adapting Murder on the Orient Express. There was the classic 1970s movie directed by Sidney Lumet.
Of course.
So there and it follows that narrative very closely. So there is a direct classic film comparison to make. Whereas A Haunting in Venice is I think it's like loosely a new adaptation. It says it's adapted from the novel Halloween Party by Agatha Christie, but from what I understand, it's actually a very loose adaptation. A lot of what Michael Green is doing narratively is pretty much his own story in conjunction with Halloween Party. So
okay, I wasn't sure. I haven't.
Yeah,
read
I think
novel,
it's like from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong for all you listeners out there and watchers out there. It's kind of like a half adaptation, half original take in some ways. It's sort of, which is where I think some of the excitement comes from, the fact that there's no direct comparison to make this to. So you're experiencing a murder mystery as an audience and no one really knows where it's going to go, right?
Yeah.
So perhaps that's clouding the judgment a little bit further then. At least it could be a possibility.
Well, and that's interesting because, and maybe I don't really know, but where is this film taking from Halloween Party in terms of its narrative through lines here and how much of it is original? Because again, if the originality, the quote unquote originality, is more so those redundant beats that we just talked about, that makes this film maybe even more frustrating.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong.
I don't know. I don't know because maybe.
Because then you might as well just say it's basically just adapting Murder on the Orient Express again in a different setting, right? Is that more or less what you're getting at?
Exactly. Now, again, if Halloween Party is doing the same thing, if Agatha Christie is regurgitating Murder on the Orient Express, but through a Halloween Party, and again, I don't know. I haven't read the novel.
I don't think she is, but I don't know for sure, so I can't confirm that.
So, so maybe I could give the film a little bit of, I could be a little lax in that way because then it's just taking what's there in the novel, and I won't fault Kenneth Branagh for that, or really Michael Green because he is the screenwriter here. So I don't know. I don't know what's adapted, what's original. All I know is if I'm looking at this film, and especially through the prism of Murder on the Orient Express, there's a redundancy there, and the editing certainly makes it choppy. But if we do move beyond that, though, and again, just looking at this on its own terms, I do think there's still a lot to like here. I do like that emotional core, and I do like the dichotomy of belief versus doubt and how that infiltrates into all of these characters funneled through a murder mystery and all of it as well. A couple of murder mysteries, really, ultimately, is how this plays out. I don't know if it's quite as intriguing, the murder mystery that is to Murder on the Orient Express for me, but I still like it because, again, what it taps into is that dichotomy, especially with Poirot, who is very fervent in his doubt, which, as we know, it comes through because of his grief and his experiences as a detective, which he speaks to.
Yeah.
And that is uprooted a little bit for reasons that are revealed later. And I do like how there's maybe a little bit of ambiguity because even though by the end of the film, his doubt has some credence to it, it's not wholly solved. Like he walks away from this series of events still wondering about what the capital T truth really is.
Yeah.
And that I did find interesting.
Yeah. I wish the film maybe emphasized that ambiguity a little bit more without telling us that it's meant to be ambiguous. You can emphasize ambiguity without telling the audience this is meant to make you think. Like you can have it both ways, right? And I think some of that, like some of those feelings maybe get a little lost because of the editing. And it's interesting. As much as I really do prefer Murder on the Orient Express as a movie, I will say of the three, A Haunting in Venice is the one that makes me most interested in seeing this series continue, and it's because of what Branagh is doing as a filmmaker. I think if you tighten the editing a little bit, maybe it's not even tightening. It's really, I hate to say it's as simple as adding scenes or making it longer, because it's never that simple. But I do think there is something disrupting the pace and the overall trajectory of this narrative. And I think if that were a bit more streamlined, and maybe if the script by Michael Green was a bit more creative in trying to make its way through some of those narrative beats that might seem similar to even something like Orient Express, then you have a really dang good murder mystery here. And I think the two of them being Michael Green and Kenneth Branagh, if they continue to keep going back to basics and maintain like this more bare bones, almost like 80s or 90s style approach to it, I think they can really make a great movie and a home run out of this. And I think this is evidence of that. And I would love to see them try again. I would love for it to not get butchered in the editing room.
I agree, because removing the redundancy element alone, and I really can forgive that because the filmmaking and the craft here is really great. That, yes, clean up the editing, and perhaps the cleaning up of the editing, now that we're talking out loud here, because I didn't really think about this earlier, but perhaps cleaning up the editing all on its own, and by making it more seamless, maybe that means including further context, meaning that there's added screen time to this, because this is a brief, 90 minutes?
It's closer to 100, but I mean, honestly, with end credits these days, I'm sure the timestamp as end credits start rolling, it might be around 98 minutes or something like that. So, it's a brief movie.
It's still rather brief. Maybe you add a little bit more, get closer to that 2-hour mark, and the murder mystery itself has a little bit more intrigue and allure to it.
Yeah.
Maybe it becomes less obvious by the time you get to the third act.
Right.
And then you have something really good on your hands. I think that's what I really liked about Murder on the Orient Express. I think the murder mystery is intriguing. The characters are fascinating. And there's an interesting thematic progression in that film that makes sense of the political and the emotional.
Yeah.
And so by the end, you walk away from that film, and while the mystery is solved, there's this dolefulness that just lingers at the end of that film.
The solving of the mystery in that movie was not a victory, which is, I love the irony of that. Yeah, there is a sorrow to it. And yeah, it is based on a classic story as well as a somewhat classic murder mystery from the 1970s. So if you've seen that, you know where it's going to go. But for a movie that is that star-studded, it can easily get, a lot of those things can easily get lost because some performances are going to overshadow others. But I actually think that movie is pretty consistently well performed.
Well,
I think that really does help it. Unlike Death on the Nile, where there are some performances that just don't work. At least half of them, if you ask me. But Orient Express is very consistent across the board. Like every performance there, I think, is at least up to the level of conveying what they need to.
And because Branagh wants to bring a certain energy to these films, and obviously his performance as Poirot, it's interesting because there is a bit of cartoonishness to him, but the character is also so grounded emotionally. Like, is a character that's just constantly grieving, and he sees everything through this pragmatic lens. Yeah, that despite the almost over the top aesthetic of him and performance, even like he blends or walks that line impeccably. Branagh does in his performance. It's really great. So I mean, with Murder on the Orient Express, while he does bring an energy to it, and you're right, he didn't write that novel, and he's adapting something that is familiar. I'm not giving credit to him as a writer in that film, but the way he walks that line in terms of energy and the dolefulness we get at the end, like as a director, the tone management of that film is really solid.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
And so that film, I think, is really great, coupled with its own aesthetics and costuming and cinematography and everything that I think is, again, underrated with that movie. This film, like all of that is there, but the editing to me just makes it a little bit more uneven, but you
Yeah.
clean that up and maybe all of those things start to fix themselves is ultimately what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, and I mentioned this in my opening thoughts. The editing is why I felt like this film, A Haunting in Venice, had some issues with tone management for me that Orient Express did not. Like, you're right, there is an energy, a bit of fun, if you will, a sort of campiness to the character of Perot, kind of maneuvering around this really serious and political and emotional murder mystery. And I feel like he's kind of trying to maneuver both extremes here with A Haunting in Venice, but his filmmaking tactics are so extreme this time. The use of canted angles here, I mean, if you thought J.J. Abrams loved his lens flare, imagine comparing that to how many canted angles are here. If it were a drinking game, you'd be drunk in 2 minutes.
Yeah,
It's ridiculous. But
I love it.
It kind of creates such a campiness. And then there are times when the film is trying to take its themes a little bit more at face value and treat it more seriously. And I think the editing makes the tone management appear a little bit sloppier. And I don't think that's really Branagh's fault. I think it really is. Well, maybe it is kind of Branagh's fault if he is still overseeing the editing in the editing room. But yeah, the maneuvering of all that, because of the overall pacing here, I think just makes the tone management feel even sloppier too.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, Branagh will take the credit or lack thereof, as any head coach for any sport will do, even if it's not their fault. And look, he might have been getting directives from executives saying, "Hey, this has to be."
That's why I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, because there maybe there was this push. Maybe there was this push that like these first two films, we don't feel like we have a money grabber here. We have to make this film as short as possible. So there could have been some push there. I don't know.
Maybe his director's cut was 2 hours and 20 minutes. And they're like, are you kidding me? Get out of here. I'm not even sitting down.
Well, then just release it straight to Amazon or Apple TV or something. I mean, I don't know. I would actually be interested in seeing that if that does exist.
I agree. I wholly agree. And given the editing and how odd it is, I do think that perhaps there was some sort of interference, or it wasn't edited the way Branagh intended. I would guess. Either way, regardless, this is the film that we got, and I do think that the choppiness of the film, for me, mostly it's the rhythm and how it undercuts more than tone.
I agree.
I do like the somber tone throughout the film and how that begins to escalate as the drama intensifies. I just wish it was a little bit more smooth. Earlier, you mentioned there was a performance that you didn't like. I'm curious what that is.
It's Tina Fey. I did not like Tina Fey.
I almost threw it out there as a guess because I was 98% confident that's who you were going to
You know me. I hate saying terrible things about actors I appreciate. And I think Tina Fey is a very talented actress. I think she's really funny. I think her
That's
role
almost the problem here.
Well,
for me,
to me, it just feels like she's line reading. That's like I felt nothing with that character. Ariadne, I believe her name is. Just the way she evokes anything, whether it be something that's a bit more tongue in cheek, or when there are aspects of that character that's meant to react a bit more seriously to certain reveals. There's no difference. It's the most expressionless performance I think I've seen all year. I think it is genuinely terrible. I think it might be her worst performance. I really do. I don't think it's good at all. And I'm sorry. I really hate saying hyperbolic statements like that, but it's unfortunate because that character is perhaps the second most utilized character of this ensemble outside of Perot himself. So and that it was just kind of a buzzkill when in that performance that has more screen time comparatively is just not working for me.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I see my issue with the character is a little bit twofold in the sense that Tina Fey is a very funny comedian.
Yeah.
And she does bring a little bit of that to this movie, for better or worse. For example, there's a moment early on when the kids are still involved and she's sitting next to two kids making out and she tells them, "Oh, here comes the nun, you better hurry," as if she is accepting of their disobedience in the moment. And
that's a funny line. It's a funny line. But here's the problem. I don't think it's funny in the movie.
Well, I laughed. I don't know if this film needs that
Oh, I
sort
don't
of
mind.
levity.
Yeah, I don't mind
don't
the
know.
levity. I actually think the film, like, because the way it embraces the macabre so heavily that there is almost this campy nature at times, I think having that levity is perfectly fine. I think it kind of fits. And I think the line itself is very funny. It's the delivery of it that just did not work for me.
I guess maybe for me there is a distinction between laugh out loud levity and the energy that Branagh wants to bring, because the
Maybe.
nature of this story is heartbreaking.
Fair.
The
Yeah.
reason they are there at this house to begin with, it comes from a place of deep sorrow, and they're wanting to find the truth.
Yeah.
And I do think that Branagh, as a filmmaker, is very aware and keen to this. So throughout the film, there is, similarly to Murder on the Orient Express, there is a dolphiness to this film, but really
Yeah.
throughout the entirety of it, where Murder on the Orient Express takes a little bit of a turn once we start to realize where the emotion of that story is coming from. We
Yeah.
know where the emotion of this story with Venice is coming from the beginning.
Yeah.
Once they arrive and they understand what they're walking into. So that sorrow is there. Branagh does bring a little bit of an energy because it is a murder mystery and it's this fun character who we love. But again, I think Branagh walks that line very well. So when you interject that with a line that is more laugh out loud, like it would come from a comedy almost, I do think that's where it maybe is borderline inappropriate tonally.
Maybe.
As much as I laughed at it, though,
Yeah,
I liked the line, but
Well,
I don't know.
I think that's the thing. Maybe I think that's why I go back to the delivery of it, because Tina Fey delivers it. And, maybe it's the fact that Tina Fey is a talented comedic actress that shouldn't be in this kind of movie.
Well, and that's one example. This happens several times throughout the film, though.
Yeah, but there's a real sense of sarcasm in Tina Fey, and it's one of her biggest traits, right? And it's one of the things that makes her so great at what she does. So maybe the long story short of this all is Tina Fey's just miscast. Maybe it's just a miscast.
Perhaps. I mean, I did enjoy her presence on screen. I think, and this is the other fold for me, as much as we can debate the humor and if it works here or not.
Yeah.
As much as I laughed at it, and in the theater I did.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing for me is the writing of it. But this does tether to what you're talking about in terms of performance, because she does settle into these murky waters performatively. And throughout the film, she, as a novelist, wants to be Poirot's right-hand woman. And she's also asking questions, and she's there with him throughout a lot of this. But as a novelist, and this is in the back of your mind, you know this, and Branagh is attuned to this, I think, as a filmmaker, that she must be involved in some sort of way.
Yeah.
Because she notes early on her last 3 books, not so great.
Yeah, so there's a sleight of hand there.
Is this something that she's manufacturing? I think the film sets that up very purposefully. So as she's involved, you're constantly thinking of her as a threat, despite the character coming off as this ally of sorts to Poirot. And then there comes a moment where Poirot does address her directly.
Yeah.
And brings up these dubious concerns. And to your point, performatively, there's not much. She does have a line where she's like, "You're questioning me?" But aside from that, her reaction is more or less the same. But then going back to the writing, the film never really doesn't fully realize that ambiguity at all.
Yeah.
Like,
Or
it
it's
just
the
kinda
editing
leaves
that
it
just
there.
forgets about it too.
Yeah,
So it
the
could have been
editing
in the
just forgets
script. I
about
don't
it.
know.
That's true. And that's where the butchering could certainly, the film could fall victim to that once again.
Yeah.
Because once Poirot addresses her, then it never really comes up again. Now, given where the film goes and the final reveals, maybe it didn't need to. It just felt a little odd in execution, I guess.
I think that's fair, and it's a film has issues when you can't really tell why it's not quite working, whether it's a performance or a script or the editing, and I feel like in a way it's almost a combination of all three. I mean, I like the idea of having someone like a Tina Fey type in that role, right? I don't know if Tina Fey was the right actress for that. Which is a shame because, and maybe it's also just a distraction because of how great this cast overall is, that it sort of just embellishes the weakness that Tina Fey is comparatively speaking. Because some of these other bit parts, young Jude Hill, from Belfast, is actually he's pretty good here.
That was going to be the next name I brought up. I loved little Jude Hill.
I agree.
And it's
yeah.
interesting because when you're introduced to a child actor who we've never known before, and he was cast in Belfast for a very specific purpose.
Yeah.
And I really liked him in Belfast. I think he's great.
Yeah.
The energy that he brings to this film is so wildly different. So I do think it's interesting that he offers some range. Like, this is a completely different performance, different character altogether from what we saw in Belfast. And I agree. I think he's really good here.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because his father is, of course, played by Jamie Dornan once again. So you have that dynamic and perhaps that chemistry helps, although they don't really share too much screen time. But I think that is what's so fascinating about Jude Hill and his character and performance.
There's like an emotional distance between them.
There is a distance there, but also a weird bond, given the context and the history of what we learn about Dr. Ferrier, excuse me. Like, he is someone who is suffering, and Jude Hill's character of Leopold is essentially the adult in that relationship. Yeah. And he's the one having to take care of his father, and how that comes through performatively, I think is excellent. I think it's really good.
Yeah. And there is a key moment in the third act, I'll simply say, involving Jude Hill that does work. And to be perfectly honest, it's a reveal I sort of thought was coming, just because of the way that these characters are laid out. You almost think that because this specific character is of a certain age, you can disregard them, that they have any like reason to to bring up anything, right? But I sort of got the sense that it was going to go a certain way about one thing, but it didn't matter because I understood the motive. I understood the context of that, and it's because you have a great performance like Jude Hill, really representing that. He is very good here.
I really like Jude Hill. I liked Jamie Dornan as well.
Jamie Dornan's good. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we can debate Tina Fey. I didn't hate. I wouldn't say. I won't go as far as to say that it's bad.
I'm that close.
I can't go that far. I can't go that
Tina,
far.
if you're listening to this, I love you. I think you are so talented. I just this is not your best work. I'm really sorry.
Yeah. For me, I think the writing doesn't help her all that much.
It doesn't. You're right.
You know, because we know that there's a motive there for her to maybe manufacture this. And so she has to play these murky waters throughout the entirety of the film. And then after the final reveal we get, there, like, the air is let out of the balloon, so she doesn't really have to do anything at that point. And so, like, it builds up this ambiguity, is she, isn't she, for no payoff or very little payoff.
Well, there's a big payoff that ultimately means nothing in some ways.
Well, I mean,
right?
for her, yeah, for her, yeah. So, like,
so maybe that's a narrative
issue.
Than
there's like
else.
30 seconds where the film addresses it, but it's kind of left up because of the editing, like that. When Perot addresses her to be like, I don't know, maybe you are involved. There's a cut because something happens, and then they all have to leave the room. Yeah. And so then it's left kind of open-ended. Now, given what we find out, again, without getting into spoilers, maybe none of it really mattered, which is why I tend to go back and forth on it. You know, like, the film builds up a lot. Like, she's walking in these murky waters for a 30-second interaction, maybe less than that. And I don't know if like for me, there wasn't much satisfaction there.
No, I'm with you.
You know what I mean? And then
I'm
it
with
kind
you.
of ends abruptly.
Yeah.
It's kind of similar to Michelle Yeoh, and I hate to keep harping back to this, but as we're talking out loud, I knew that I had, I felt the same way you did about the pacing of the film. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it completely disrupted my experience or anything, because as I noted earlier, I still enjoyed the movie on the whole.
Okay.
But I think similarly, now that we're talking here, it's a little bit of the same thing with Michelle Yeoh's character of Joyce, because she comes into the fold as this psychic medium, and then she does the seance that I'll say vaguely is interrupted by Poirot, and there's an element of pragmatism to that interruption. So as far as the seance goes, is it real or isn't it real?
Yeah.
Because the aftermath of it suggests that at least some of it wasn't real. But I don't know if it fully answers if the entire thing was manufactured. Characters speak to it as if, yes, it was manufactured, but that's all we're told. And there's still ambiguity as far as I mentioned earlier, the ghostly lingering of this film is never fully realized. That's never fully answered. And Branagh wants to have the ambiguity at the end for his own character, for Poirot's sake.
Right.
So there's still an element of truth to Joyce as this psychic medium that the film basically forgets midway through.
Yeah, no, you're
It never
right.
goes back to it.
I mean, I like the idea that ambiguity is maintained in some way. I think that's the right call. I guess I'm not sure if it was the right call to still incorporate that ambiguity within the mechanics of what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Like
because when it comes to Joyce herself, in the seance, there's two elements to the seance. I'm trying to avoid spoilers, obviously. So, but for those that have seen the film, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's two elements. There's a typewriter element, and again, there's a reveal to that. And then there's the aftermath of the reveal as the seance finishes.
Yeah.
Is that wholly manufactured on Joyce's part? Maybe. Again, characters later on say yes. So we're told yes. But because of that ambiguity, the ghostly ambiguity of this film, are we sure about that? Because Branagh wants to have his cake and eat it too.
And I'm not sure if that's the right kind of ambiguity, at least in that part. I think there's a moment towards the end, a visual moment towards the end, overlooking the rainy night sky of Venice, I'll simply say. That right there could have been all the ambiguity that you needed, right? Just that one shot.
Yes.
And that is right there.
And Poirot's reaction at the end of the film, because Tina Fey's character of
Ariadne?
Ariadne.
I think that's her name.
Yes. Because she asked him, like, well, do you believe or don't you believe? And again, Branagh wants to have his cake and eat it too. Poirot is a pragmatic person who has his doubts. But because of this experience and that specific shot you just referenced, he wants to have some ambiguity. Maybe Poirot did see something. Maybe he did leave with a little bit of belief. Maybe he doesn't know anymore. Branagh wants us to linger in that. He wants the ambiguity, at least for Poirot, and what that means to him on an emotional level and even a thematic level. So, and I like that. I think that works, especially for Poirot. But if we tether that back to Joyce, because at a certain point, we're just supposed to believe Joyce was a hack. But if we're to believe Branagh and Poirot at the end, that means that there's some credence to Joyce. But the film never gives us an answer to that one way or another. So it's like,
no, it doesn't.
I don't know if the film has its cake and eat it too. At least not with Joyce.
No, I'm with you there. It just, I think we talked about this a lot with other movies, right? When you're trying to have your cake and eat it too, when a movie is trying to, at least, by being ambiguous or nuanced about something, there's the right kind and there's the wrong kind. And I feel like this movie kind of does both. Like when it gets very bogged down by the mechanics, but it's still trying to maintain some sense of uncertainty. I admire that, but I don't know if that was the right time for that.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a lot you can achieve with just mere visual storytelling. And that one shot where dancing around that happens at the end, I think is enough to do just what you need. And
I
I
agree.
kind of wish like that one shot there did all the work for us.
I agree. I agree, and I wish the editing was more seamless to make sense of that from Joyce's perspective. Because
Agreed.
Michelle Yeoh is great. I
Yeah.
love what she brings to this film.
Like I said,
but
it's a wild performance. I
Yeah.
called it wonky earlier, but there kind of is a wonkiness to it. That aftermath of the seance is, yeah, she's committed to the bit. I'll simply say that.
she is. It's so good.
Yeah,
So
it's great.
good. Any other final thoughts here you have on A Haunting in Venice?
I do want to emphasize once again. I think you brought this up, just how. Well, I mean, we both brought this up, just how inventive the film is. This does feel like Branagh is trying to go back to his roots a little bit. He made a movie in the early '90s called Dead Again that he also starred in, that sort of had these kind of campy horror macabre like elements to it. And I like that he's embracing it once again here. And I kind of hope he does it again if he's going to continue this series. Weirdly, like I said, I don't think this is the best movie of the bunch, but it's the one that makes me most excited to see it continue, because I see the potential more so than I ever did. And I think a tighter version of this is poised for success, if you ask me. So I understand why this is being reviewed as the best of the three, because of those creative aesthetics that we keep talking about. I wish it was in a tighter movie. I really do.
I agree. As much as we harp on the editing and how that disrupts its pacing and rhythm, that really was the biggest thing for me. And I probably came off more negative in this conversation than I really am on it. But that's how much the editing here is frustrating, because if this is tighter, if it's more seamless, maybe if there's more added here to give further context so it can have its cake and eat it too, I would really love this film.
Yeah.
As it stands, I still really like it. I enjoyed my experience. I love Branagh, what he brings to this character as a performer and as a filmmaker. I think the cinematography here is just riveting. It's really great. The
really
sound
good.
design is fantastic. I love how he's going out of his way, especially because so much of this film, outside of the bookends of this movie, it all takes place within this one building. And you do see him creatively using various angles, camera tricks to make every frame, every shot unique. And I do think that is ultimately very effective here. I think
agree.
simply as a visual, a sound, a cinematic experience, it is very good. Maybe one of his best even. It's really just an editing storytelling thing for me.
It just proves that sometimes a director is at his or her best when they're working on a limited budget. And I don't know for sure. I'd have to confirm the budget comparisons between this one and, let's say, Death on the Nile, for instance. I feel like I need to look that up right now just to fact check myself, because my hunch is this is the cheaper movie. Like, that's my guess. But I don't know for sure. You might have to, as I'm guessing you're looking this up right now. I kind of want you to fact check me on this.
All right. So Murder on the Orient Express was $55 million, according to this.
Okay.
And Death on the Nile was 90 to 100 million.
And of course, it shows. The more expensive it is, the worse it looks, right?
Because this was 60 million. So this is much closer to Murder on the Orient Express.
Yeah.
And to be fair to Branagh, and I think maybe, and again, and maybe this is myopic of me to say because I don't really know, but is it more expensive because the film, speaking of Death on the Nile, had to use so much visual effects and visual shots because it was produced during COVID? They couldn't go anywhere. They couldn't actually go to the Nile. So in order to make that movie, we had to digitally manufacture the whole thing. And that adds up.
That's fair. That's
I'm
fair.
guessing that's what it is rather than shooting on location or on a practical, tangible set as what we got with Venice and Murder on the Orient Express. Because the lesser of those budgets, like, yeah, I mean, 55 million and 60 million respectively. And both of those films, Venice and Orient Express, are visually incredible. They're really, really good.
Yeah,
So,
it's I feel like it's a common reaction we have nowadays, at least those of us in the hashtag film Twitter sphere, is that especially with Disney movies, right, or movies produced by the overall parent Disney company, at the higher the budget is, the more we tend to criticize the way they look. I mean that does happen at times, and I feel like maybe I'm wrongly taking that same logic into this, but. I mean, there are circumstances around Death on the Nile. You're right that perhaps led to more money being spent to at least get that movie done. So I get that, but yeah, the bare bones nature of Haunting in Venice, I do think is its biggest asset. Right? The fact that there is a real tangibility to it.
I agree. I mean, and even something like Belfast, and I still wholly believe no one would ever be able to convince me otherwise. The reason that film has any vitriol whatsoever is because it was up for awards. And guess what? A Haunting in Venice is not. So surprisingly, much less vitriol.
Well, yeah, movie. it's a type of reaction it gets, I guess. I hate sports. I hate sports now when it comes to film.
I say that to say because that Belfast was shot for $10 million, $15 million.
Yeah.
And it looks great. It looks good. I don't care whether you think it doesn't deserve to be up for Best Cinematography and Best Picture. I don't care. Don't care. That film on its own terms is really well crafted, really well performed.
Because
really
you know
well
how
shot.
it works, right? The 5 movies that are nominated for Best Cinematography, those are the only 5 good-looking movies of the year, right? That's
exactly.
That's how it works.
Like, yeah, it's the only reason people lose their goddamn minds over Belfast. It is a well-shot movie. Okay? You don't have to like the film, but you can't deny its cinematography.
You don't even have to think it's one of the 5 best shot movies of the year.
Yes.
But if you're going to say it's a terrible,
I don't care.
If you're going to say it's a terribly shot film just because it got an Oscar nomination,
that's where you lose all credence to me.
Yeah,
it
that's
doesn't
where the
have
credibility
to be in your
goes
top
out the window.
5.
Yeah.
Exactly. Doesn't have to be in your top 15. I don't care. I don't care how you rank it or where you rank it. But yes, you lose credibility the moment you're like, that's terrible.
And I love how this turned into some type of awards rant.
Sorry, it drives me crazy.
Yeah, you would think this was a film podcast after all, wouldn't you?
And look, awards doesn't have to be a bad thing. It doesn't. I can enjoy it too. I do enjoy it. We talk about it here on the show. We just had an episode with Brian Rowe and Shadon Larkey talking about awards. It was a really fun time. I enjoyed the hell out of it.
For sure.
But the discourse is insane. Like, it's just utterly insane.
Belfast, pretty good movie. Pretty good movie. I like it. It's not my favorite Branagh film, but I like it.
Which is perfectly fair.
Yeah.
Perfectly fair. My point in all of that is to say, Branagh, say what you will about him as a storyteller. I think the man is a craftsman. He makes good looking movies when it's not done during COVID and he has to use a bajillion VFX shots.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate reality.
Because Death on the Nile, you look at his filmography, that is an insane outlier. Visually speaking.
You're absolutely right.
From a craft perspective. Like, and not just the cinematography, but the editing. You noted the performances earlier. Like, everything about that film is just so odd, especially for Branagh.
Yeah.
At least within the last 10, 15 years, I'd say.
Yeah.
Maybe
his
his entire career. It's weird. Anyway, he makes good looking movies. I think it's a little bit underrated because people don't look at him like a Scorsese or a Nolan. And look, maybe he's not. He doesn't necessarily have the storytelling chops as those guys, although he's not really trying to do the same kind of movies. For what he's doing, I think he makes really appealing movies from a sensory perspective. And
Yeah.
they're mostly entertaining.
Well, when he's working on Shakespeare, he certainly has something there.
I agree.
If he ever adapts a Shakespeare play again, I'm sure it'll end up being his best film since his last Shakespeare adaptation.
Probably. Probably. Anyway, that was a long tangent to say. I just think he's a little underrated. That's all.
He's a good director.
That's all. Yeah, he's good.
In fact, I think his Thor is the best Thor movie.
Yes.
No,
Hot
did I
Take
just
City?
open up another rant here?
I think so. I think you might have opened up a little bit of a can of worms there, but I don't think you're wrong.
I like that Thor movie. I think it's quite good.
I do too. It's good. I'm sorry. It's good. It's the best of them. Anyway, if you agree or disagree with any of
I'm
our
done.
thoughts,
I'm done.
might as well transition to that.
Yeah.
You can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. Of course, you can reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, wherever you want to reach out to us. You can email us sensationfilm@gmail.com.
Wow, you sound out of breath with that one.
Yeah, I was talking really fast there.
Wow, yeah, I thought you were out of breath from all the rants that we went on. I was about
That
to say
too.
another. I was about
it's
to
all
say
of the
another.
above.
I was about to say another one and say Kenneth Branagh's adaptation of Cinderella is actually one of my favorites of the Disney live action ones.
Like, and it's interesting because over time I feel like I've been, it's like, okay, I like Jungle Book, I like The Little Mermaid, like this, like that. A lot of the live action remakes have been, I just wish they would stop, I guess, is ultimately where I'm at now.
Or
And-
adapt ones that need to be adapted again or retold again in a new way.
And I still like the Jungle Book, but on the whole, in retrospect, I think you're right. I think that Cinderella film is probably the best of them.
Yeah, because it feels like its own thing. Like it's one that, I mean, it tells the same story, but it has a sensibility to it that it feels like its own movie in some
I guess
ways.
that's why I like Mulan. Mulan isn't the best film. I would still give that to Cinderella. But I love that Mulan is nothing like the animated film.
It is at times, but it is one that does feel more disconnected from the animated film than, let's say, The Lion King, for instance.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Which is beat for beat.
It is. Yeah.
Mulan is very, very different. That at least gets a lot of points for me. But
Yeah, I agree.
yeah, anyway, all that to say, you're right.
Cinderella,
is
good.
probably the best of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We will see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, I love a little Perot.
Me too. Tina Fey, I'm sorry. I still love you.
Jude Hill!